Except it's October.
Except it is October, you're right. Yeah, I lost a lot of time. I've been gone out of town a long time and my calendar's messed up. So it's our October program. We will not have another program until February, and that will be at the Town Hall the last Wednesday in February. I can't remember the exact date, but it will be at the Town Hall. And we have some items over there for sale, a few books for sale, and some things just for donation, if you care to give a donation. And I would like to introduce my friend Phil Jordan. You know, he doesn't really need any introduction because everybody here knows him, but come on up here, Phil. I've known Phil since we were very young, and my mother was his Cub Scout leader.
That's right. Roar, roar, den 4. That was our cheer was Roar, roar, den 4 as Cub Scouts, and Helen Bardo's den was Cock-a-doodle-doo den 2. So that's the show. Thank you for coming. So this, I think, is my 5th year that I've presented a talk, and one thing that I've been gifted with is the ability to run my mouth, and Irish people have that ability, so it's the gift of gab. So I never prepare anything, so I just talk, and I've talked about being a paper boy here in Candor, and talked about being a funeral director here in Candor, talked about working at the store in Candor, talked about my work in the church in Candor, talked about people in Candor, and tonight I'm going to talk about myself. Many people, I just had a woman come to me for a consultation this week, and she came up from Pennsylvania, and she says, I told a woman that I was going to Candor, and she says, oh, I know where Candor is. It's known for 2 things, Phil Jordan and the Iron Kettle Farm pumpkin farm. So that's what it's known for, is Phil Jordan and the Iron Kettle Pumpkin Farm. So I don't know which goes first, but years ago, we were known for the Small Town and Mass Society, which was a book written about Candor and the people that were in the hierarchy of Candor, people that were, that these 2 sociologists came and wrote a book about Candor. And then there was another moment of fame when Harry Chapin got stopped for speeding and wrote a song about it called The Mayor of Candor Lied. And that song, I'm sure you can find that on the internet. Good to see so many people. Can you hear me in the back okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I'm going to start telling you a little bit about my life. There'll be a few things that you can relate to for Halloween, I think, because there'll be a couple ghost stories. And what I tell you tonight is my beliefs and things that I've believed through my life. And my life is constantly changing, and my beliefs are constantly changing. But I like to tell people sort of my perspective and my version of things. And it does get to be quite interesting. My life has been one that I never would have believed I've done the things that I've done. And some of them you know about, some of them you don't know about. Some of the people that I've worked with in my life. And started out, I was born January 29th of 1950, 20 minutes ahead of my twin sister. And so I've always been her older brother. And I have an older sister, Rose Bish, and a younger brother, Rick Jordan. And I have a half-sister that we didn't know for 44 years, and we found her. She lives out above Seattle, Washington. Ruth Ann Dahl's her name. And so my mother was 4'11", and we were full-term twins. And I weighed 7'2", and Phyllis weighed 6'14". So 14 pounds a baby. And the week before we were born, she had to be in a wheelchair because if she stood up, she fell over frontwards. And so that's the truth. And she would fall over frontwards. And back then, they didn't have tests to know there was twins. But my mother kept telling the doctor, "There's twins there." And he says, "No, it's just a big boy." Big boy. She says, "Well, then it's a male octopus because there's 8 arms and legs." And my father thought it was he went from the hospital to the payphone and called everybody and said, "I have a boy, I got my baseball player." And he went back to the delivery room, and the doctor says, "You also have a cheerleader." And so that's when we started out. We were not a wealthy family. We lived on Humiston Street. But we had everything we needed. We lived in the era where no one knew they were poor. You know, we could find an old can and play kick the can, or a couple old wheels and build a soapbox derby type car and have snowball fights and be out till the street lights come on, then you had to be home. You didn't have to worry about being abducted or shot or anything like that. And so it was, the 50s was probably the best era in the United States to grow up in. It was just a wonderful time. My mother, her grandmother came from Ireland, so she was very superstitious. I grew up with all kinds of superstitions and still have them, because once you learn those, they don't leave you, because you just have to obey them just in case, you know, just in case. And so there was a lot of superstitions in our household. And a lot of them were concerning death and dying, and just luck and bad luck and good luck and everything like that. And my mother was very into interpreting dreams, because that's an Irish thing, is your mind stays awake while you're sleeping, your unconscious mind, and your conscious mind rests the body. And the unconscious mind creates a dream around things going on, and so she interpreted her dreams. I remember when I was quite young, I woke up one morning and we were having breakfast, and my mother said, "One of the neighbors died last night." And I thought, how did she know that one of the neighbors died last night? We were poor people, we didn't have a phone. You know, how did she know that? I says, "How did you know somebody died last night?" Because a black coach came down the street in my dreams, pulled by 6 black horses. Turned around, it was a dead-end street we lived on, turned around at the street, stopped in the middle of the street. A guy in a cloaked jacket, coat, with a top hat got off, opened the door, no one got in. He closed the door and took off. And she looked at me and she says, "That means they harvested a spirit last night off the street." And I was like 11 years old, and I thought, harvested a spirit? Is there a season of harvest? You know, so 20 minutes later, back then everybody on the street collected for funeral flowers. For all the neighbors got together and put a quarter or 50 cents together and was able to get a bouquet from the neighbors. 20 minutes after my mother told me that, the neighbor came to the door and said, "Mr. German died last night, and in the night, and we're collecting for flowers." And I thought, oh my God, they are harvesting spirits off the street. And she just knew things and she encouraged me to know things, to use my wisdom, my spiritual wisdom, to understand and know things. And at a very early age, the age of 7, I became very involved in my faith. I just knew, because I grew up in a sort of a dysfunctional home. My father was an alcoholic, and so I had to rely on something beyond myself, you know. So I developed a very strong connection with God, and I felt Jesus was my buddy, okay? And at nights I would put my hand outside the covers and pretend he was holding my hand, you know? And so we developed a close relationship, which I've relied on all my life. And some people think the things I do are a little bit evil or satanic or whatever, but it's people that don't know me, and it's ignorance on their part. So there's a lot of ignorant people in the world, so I just pass that by. And so as I kept going in life, around the age of 16, it was in May of 66, I had an uncle who filled in as my father, and it was my mother's sister's husband, and my mother's sister was 18 years older than my mother, so they had no children, so us kids were the grandchildren, so to speak. And so at the age of 16, it was a beautiful May morning. I saw the neighbor come across the lawn, and my mother says, "I wonder what she wants." And I had had a dream 6 hours before that, and woke from a dream that my uncle had had a heart attack and wasn't expected to live. But in the dream, I took my mother, went to the hospital, and in the dream, a nurse came through these 2 gray doors, and I could see my mother looking at her name tag, and I saw the name on the name tag. And then she said, "Well, he's only going to live for about another 5 hours probably, and he'll die." And in the dream, a doctor came through the double doors, and he had a bald head, dark hair, glasses, and he said, "Why don't you go in and cheer him on a little bit? Maybe that'll help him." So I went in, and in the dream, it was very dark in there, but there was machines beeping, and he was sitting up in bed, and he says, "They think I'm going to die, but I'm not." And he winked at me and smiled. And so the next morning, when the neighbor came across the yard, we were poor people, didn't have a phone, she says, "You got to go to the hospital right away. Your brother-in-law's had a heart attack and not expected to live." So I took my mother. I'd just gotten my permit. My mother only drove in town. Those that might remember my mother, she was 4'11" and had to look through the steering wheel to drive. It always looked like the car was going by itself, okay? And she was 4'11" squared, and it was fun to watch her drive. So I drove her to the hospital in Ithaca, and this nurse comes through these double gray doors. And I saw my mother looking at her name tag, and it was the name I'd given my mother from the dream. First and last name.
Wow.
So just then a doctor comes through, the exact doctor I saw in my dream. He says, "Why don't you go in and try to encourage him a little bit?" So I went in, and my mother was still in the waiting room talking to other people. And I went in, and my uncle was all groggy from medications and tethered to machinery. But he turned his head towards me as I took his hand, and he winked at me and he smiled. And I just knew he wasn't going to die. So the Irish people bury their dead before the last heartbeat. They figure out what they're going to be laid out in. That's the first thing. Then what kind of casket? Is it going to be metal or wood, or, you know, what are we going to do? Back then you didn't cremate, but you buried. And so I went out in the waiting room, and I says, he's not going to die. He's going to live. No, you've got to prepare yourself. He's going to die. He's going to die. I said, no, he's not. He's going to live. He lived 13 more years. He had 3 more coronaries, and each time he had them, one time I was in Plattsburgh doing a program, and I called home and the ambulance was there taking him away to the hospital. One time I was in Florida and I got a feeling, so I called their house and the ambulance was there taking him away. And one time I was in a wedding in Ithaca. At the head table just served a nice steak dinner. And I got that feeling, so I excused myself and I went to their house in Ithaca, and the ambulance was there taking him away. And the last time was the day after their 60th anniversary, and I had a friend who was in a monastic life, a monk, and he was staying with me. He had come to their anniversary party, 60th anniversary party, and I said, tonight my uncle will die, and 58 minutes after we got there, he died. And I told him it'd be within the hour. So that made me aware of the bond of connection of love, because he was a father to me. And the bond of love is connected to all of us. Some of you know when something's wrong with your kids, or they might be in California, you might be here, and you just know something is, and that's what I say is part of the gift of love, that we're all connected. And we all have different opinions. I grew up as an Episcopalian at St. Mark's and still consider myself an Episcopalian, even though I'm pastor of St. Luke's Chapel in Venetton. And the sacraments are very, very important to me. I do get a little discouraged over some of the sacraments now not being honored, like marriage, especially when your best friend is your minister. But anyway, that's beside the point. Each to their own. From that time on, I could see things, and a lot of the people that were psychic in life, like Peter Herkos was the psychic who solved the Boston Strangler case. And he was a painter, and he'd fallen off a ladder and was in a coma. When he woke up, he could just perceive things. And I think with me, the things that occurred for me was some of the tragedies of my dysfunctional life and things, and I needed to know what lies beyond. And I've had countless experiences, not only with psychic things, but also with spiritual things. And I think that's where our religion, our differences of opinions. Last Saturday I spoke about being different, because I've always knew that I was different. When I was a kid, I would spend all day walking from the dam up here down to Anderson Grove, down by Kelsey Road, all by myself fishing, because I sort of knew I was different. And those who know me can validate I'm different. But as time went on, people started asking me things because they knew what had happened with my uncle. And I would tell them things like, one of the neighbors said, "What can you tell me?" And I said, "You're going to have company come here from Michigan, and it's somehow I don't feel happy about it, but they're going to come from Michigan." And she says, "Oh, they were here a month ago and went back, and we had a little bit of a disagreement, so that's why you felt the turmoil." 3 days later, they had a relative die, and they had to come back from Michigan, and that's what the turmoil was about. So from then on, the neighbor told neighbors, and neighbors told neighbors, and pretty soon word got out that I was weird. And but I've always backed my work with my faith. because I believe that God gives us talents as gifts. And my gift, I would love to have been able to play the piano or sing, but that didn't happen. And so we have to share our gifts in what way possible. So I did my best to begin to share my gift. When I graduated from high school, of course, the Vietnam War was raging, and I would have served, but I didn't get drafted, number one, and number two, I didn't want to serve because I knew there was big snakes in Vietnam, and I'm scared to death of snakes, okay? But I certainly appreciate those that did serve and love them for what they've done for us and still do for us. But my guidance counselor told me he thought I should go and become a male nurse. And I said to him, I says, now, you're talking to a man who got 2 shots in one arm, 2 shots in the other for influenza and various measles and things. And I walked out in the hallway and said to my sister, that didn't hurt a bit, and proceeded to pass out onto my face. And I said, and you want me to be a male nurse? I said, that wouldn't look good to pass out across the feet of somebody that needed a male nurse. But later on, I went on to become a funeral director. So I overcame that little fear there as far as that goes. Probably one of my greatest gifts, and I've talked about it here, was being a paper boy in Candor for 5 years. I got to know the dirt on everybody. You know? I knew who was having affairs and who they were having them with, and I knew what was going on in town, and that was good. I decided I went to school for 2 years at Corning Community College, got a degree in humanities and social science, and then I went to Brockport State University and became a Spanish teacher. And I found that interesting. The only reason I did that was my Irish disposition, because Mr. Okonski told me I'd probably never learn to speak Spanish. So I went on to learn to teach it. Okay, and I've maintained my fluency pretty well in my Spanish. And so I was called home because my mother had died and my father was not good and he needed somebody living with him. So I did my student teaching in Spencer. And it was interesting because they had just implemented Spanish as one of the 2 languages taught in Spencer. French was the other. And I didn't speak French, but the French teacher didn't speak Spanish. So she was teaching a Spanish class by listening to records in the library and then teaching what she heard the next day. So I was supposed to have 2 weeks before I taught Spanish, I was to observe, and she had me teaching the very next day because she couldn't teach it. And she was saying, like the Spanish word for book is libro, and she was teaching them with an O at the end of book, buco. And so I don't know how they ended up, but they did okay. So, but because I was in Spencer and doing my student teaching, I stayed in Spencer in a small apartment for a while. And one August 4th evening, there was a violent thunderstorm. I had done a program down in Pennsylvania. I got home and terrible downpour and terrible electric storm. And my landlord was a fire policeman. And he was out on a fire call, and his wife stopped me in the back door as I was running through the rain to get to my apartment, and she says, there's a little boy missing up at Empire Lake, 6 years old, and they think he's in the lake and drowned. And what can you tell us? And I said, well, I don't think he's dead. I think he's going to be asleep under a tree. And she says, oh no, he had a swim toy, he had a swimming suit on, and he's probably in the lake, but could you go up and see if you could find him with your gift? And so I said, well, I can, but I can't go till morning, because if I go at night, I'm going to miss something. And I've got to have daylight to see what I'm doing. They had 200 searchers searching for him that night. And around midnight, his father called me and asked me to come up, and I told him I can't come till daylight. His father was a reporter for the Binghamton Press, and they had done an article on me where they had hit a staple puller in the top of a gas tank in Marathon, and I went and found it. I went with a police officer out of town, and I came back in and found it within 12 minutes, and using my abilities. So he thought I can find his son. And I says, well, I'll do my best, but I drew a map of how I felt I had to go, and I felt the lake, and I could see 3 overturned boats, and then I could see across the lake, I could see a building. And I knew I had to go into a path behind that building, go up, find a clearing where there'd be a pile of stones, and then continue, like if it was a clock, I'd continue at 11, and I'd go till I found a ravine, and then we would find him. And so we got a guy that knew the woods, and one of his friends, and I was friends with Dave Redsicker, who was the investigator for the sheriff's department. And so I'm standing there looking across, and it was a big wall tent. It wasn't a building. It was a big wall tent. And I said, we got to go in over there. And Dave and the other guy that knew the woods said, that's the wrong direction. He was last seen way over here. And I said, well, I can't betray my feelings. I got to go where I got to go. And so the guy that knew the woods said, I think I know where you're talking about, but it's 7 miles this other way. And I said, well, that kid 6 years old, couldn't have gone 7 miles in the dark. And so I said, well, go in there. And they kept trying to talk me into going to the other place. And I said, no, I can't do that. So I told my landlord on the way up, I says, we'll find him within an hour. And so we continue up, and I was all ready to say to the guy, okay, we'll go check out your place, and I'll come back here later. And I looked down, and in the mud, it was very muddy, there was one footprint, and it was of a child. And it was going up the hill, and I says, here's a footprint. And we went up the hill till we found the clearing, and somebody was building a lean-to, and they had put a stone foundation around and had a pile of rocks there. Went in at 11 o'clock, and I was on the ambulance at the time, ambulance crew, so I said, well, I have the training, I'll go down in case he's fallen into the gorge. And you two of you on one side, 2 on the other, and keep yelling his name, Tommy Kennedy. And he might listen to both if he's in shock or whatever. So the guy that was trying to talk me out of going up the hill, he kept yelling his name, first and last name. I said, do you hear him? He says, no, I don't hear him. And I thought, well, I don't trust you because you tried to talk me into going the other way. And so I said to Dave, do you hear him yelling? Do you hear him yelling for help? No, I don't hear a thing. And I thought, oh gosh, I'm looking like a fool. All of a sudden, Dave says, I do hear him yelling. He's yelling for help. And they ran towards where he was, and I had to climb up out of this 30-foot ravine. They climbed over a fence, and I vaulted the fence and sprained my back, and I was in far worse shape than Tommy Kennedy was. And we had awakened him. He was asleep under a tree. And he had walked within 10 feet of a well, an open well. And and that sort of started my career. That started my career as a psychic. The sheriff, Ray Ayers at the time, he had said to me, I don't believe any of that stuff, but he says, I listened to it on the radio, and the guys came back and said, that was unbelievable. So I want you to be a deputy. And it was interesting because 2 years before that, I had gone for a reading myself to a woman in Binghamton, and she says, I see you standing in front of a flag raising your hand, taking an oath. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to Vietnam, I know I am. So he said, I want you to become a deputy, and I'll send you through police academy. So I thought, you know what, why not? So I got a uniform, and I went to the courthouse to be sworn in, and as I raised my right hand to be sworn in, I remembered what she said, and it fit the occasion, and so I became a deputy. And I was a special deputy for a long time and on loan to agencies all over the country. I've solved probably close to 30 unsolved homicides that both local and everywhere, and 20 of them are documented on court TV and psychic detectives and things like that. And so that became my career, but I still wanted to be a priest in the Episcopal Church, because since the age of 7, I felt like God wants me to do that. I guess I better do that. So the church at the time had what was called Canon 10 studies. And you could study with a mentor priest and then become ordained after 3 or 4 years. So I put 3 years into it and all kinds of testing and stuff, and the Commission on Ministry had to vote whether I should be a priest or not. And there was one priest who felt that I shouldn't be a psychic shouldn't be a priest in the church. He got 3 others to vote against me, and I was barred from furthering my seminary studies. And I was devastated, just devastated. I didn't leave the church, but I didn't take communion because they made me feel like I was dirty. And they had asked me to not do my psychic work for a year, so I almost went to the poorhouse. And I didn't do it for a year, but then I got canned at the end. And I just felt that wasn't fair. That wasn't fair. But I prayed on it and felt that God wanted me to do it still, but in another capacity. So a few years later, I had opened the Candor Funeral Parlor, and I had a man who was opened it with me, Kevin Sharp, and it was going well, and I suddenly decided that I should get my license, and so I called on a Friday to Simmons School of Mortuary Science, and I started on Monday. They had one opening. One guy had decided not to go. They had one opening, and so I went to Simmons and traveled from Candor to Syracuse every day for a year. And then, while I did that, I ran the restaurant in Catatunk, and while I did that, I went to night school at Elmira College and got my master's degree in education and counseling. And so I did all that in 1 year. And I thought, how did I do that? I think of that now. How did I do that? And so during that time, I had a woman who was a doctor in psychology who was a friend of mine. And she says, I have a friend who said that he would ordain you in his non-denominational church in Rochester. And I said, oh God, I'm an Episcopalian. How can I do that? So I said, well, there's only one way of doing it. Do it. So I went and got ordained, and the minister of the church said, now, I know you want to be an Episcopal priest. You should always wear a collar. And he says, because if you wear the white collar, he says that will curb some of your vocabulary. And I said, well, that comes from being in Candor, you know. You got to speak the language, you know. So I got my funeral director's license and was ordained all the same at the same time. And I had decided that I wanted to redo St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Prospect Valley. That was tied up in the estate, an estate, Kathy's parents. It was tied up in that estate, so it didn't work. So I stopped at my cousin's over in Caroline Center, and she says, you should be pastor of our church. It's been closed 14 years. I said, and she says, but you should be our pastor. And I says, well, I'd like to look at it. And I went and saw it was a beautiful little country church. And so I said, well, we'll have to talk to the board. So the board was filled with all these old, strict people that I thought, I don't think I can do this. And the only question I was asked was, you don't talk in tongues, do you? And I says, well, not recently or ever. And so I took on the role of the church, and for 33 years was pastor there. I'm now pastor emeritus. And lovely little church. They redid the whole church. When I took it over, we had an outhouse out back, and we put in bathrooms, and it's been a wonderful part of my life. That part of my life was wonderful. And then we had a bit of a disagreement over gay marriage at the church, and so things got a little rocky. And I did a wedding at the former Catholic church in Venetton. A woman had bought it she flipped houses and stuff, and so I did the wedding, and I said to her, God, that's a beautiful church. I'd love to have that church. She says, I can get it. I can make it so you get it. I said, oh, okay. So I said, well, how can I do that? And she says, I'll sell it for $30,000 less than I'm asking. And I said, well, give it a try. So I mortgaged my house and bought the church. Got a board together, and we've had church there 10 years this next month. And we meet Saturdays at 4:30. We have communion very similar to the Episcopal Church. And then Sunday mornings I go with my sister to St. John's in Speedsville, because I'm still an Episcopalian. Once an Episcopalian, always an Episcopalian. And right now I'm getting my thoughts together on how my spiritual work, my psychic work, my ministry, my funeral directing, my life in general all comes together. And people will quote me scripture all the time, and I always tell people, read the Bible at home on your own, because it's meant for you to read at home on your own, because I can tell you what I perceive, but that's not what you perceive. Well, there's no such things as psychics. It's the work of the devil. And I says, well, you know, I feel I've carried my life in a very Christian way. Very Christian way, by doing police work and church, and you know, I mean, some weekends I went to church 3 times. So I figure I've got about 12 years of good time built up, so I don't have to go to church. But, well, none of that, your dreams and all that stuff, that is, I says, what about St. Joseph? St. Joseph had a dream to get the Christ child away from the rule of Herod. What about the Blessed Mother, who believed that God spoke to her and told her to carry the baby? What about those people? That was back then. And I says, they were just as human as I am. And I said, I'm convinced all of us are on a human journey. And we're also on a spiritual journey. We're always looking for what makes our heart glad. And that we can feel love. And I think that, again, Scripture you can define whatever way you need it to fit. You know, and that's the divinity of Scripture, is that it works for everyone. But I always think that it's written special for me, and special for you, and special for you. And so it's never hindered my progression in my work. And I often think, for being as bad as I am, as some people think, I do an awful lot of funerals and weddings. You know, I do probably 90% of the funerals in town. And I think it's because I honor the God within that person. And I think that that's what we have to do, is honor the God within that person and how they present that God to us. You know, and I think that I could read Scripture for 45 minutes at a funeral and people soon begin to get antsy. But I like to talk about the person, especially if I know the dirt on the person. You know, I like to tell the things they did. I did a funeral yesterday for a woman who loved to go to Tioga Downs. And I said, I enjoy going to Tioga Downs too. You know, I talked to her 2 weeks before she died. And so at her funeral, I says, you know, she went to my church. And she did go to my church in Caroline Center. But she also went to the church in Nichols, in Tioga Downs. And I always say that it's a church with two steeples, because there's two steeples. And everyone makes a donation. They're always praying. Always praying. And so often I hear the Lord's name. So I call that the church with two steeples. And so several people I know that I've done their funerals, I tell that story, and they love it. But a funeral is to honor the person who carried their spirit of God within them to us and shared in the gift of love. And it's those things. I've had people come up to me and say, one time years ago I was doing a funeral for a friend, and a guy come up to me and says, you know, I'm a born-again Christian, and you aren't a Christian, and I'm concerned that you're doing this funeral. And I spoke in words that he could understand. I said, I have a funeral to do, and I'm going to do it. And I said, you should read Matthew 7, where it says, judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you'll be judged also. You know, and Scripture can justify anything, you know, but I believe that our human journey is also a spiritual journey, and one complements the other. When there's a tragedy, it's my duty as a minister to tell people that human things happen. There's accidents that take a life. Why would God do that? God didn't do that. It was part of human tragedy. But your faith will see you through that. And my faith has seen me through everything. And yes, I believe our loved ones are around us in spirit. And people have this idea that they have to, I find funeral work interesting to me, and I always have, because, well, you know, I was in my internship, I was doing a funeral, and minister stood by the casket of this elderly woman. Grandchildren were all in the front row, and he says, now, you kids think that Grandma died. She didn't. She's just sleeping. And she'll get up someday and walk with Jesus. So we get to the cemetery, and the vault is there, the lid to the vault with her name on it. And the kid, I heard him say to his mother, "What's that?" And they put it on top of the casket. And how's Grandma going to get out of there to walk with Jesus? Innocence of youth, you know. And I thought, well, I probably didn't do a good job as a funeral director if she gets out of there. But but I think that my spiritual journey continues. As I get older, there's things I don't believe today that I believed in years ago. You know, the Bible tells us, in my Father's house are many mansions. And I always have thought, oh God, I hope my mother didn't go to a mansion. She'd be so uncomfortable because we were poor people. We didn't live in a mansion. She wouldn't know how to act. She didn't, you know, it's all in our interpretation. But biblically, there's everything I do can be seen in the Bible. And I believe that our loved ones are simply around us and will let us know they're around us. I'll tell you a couple stories before I finish. Ghost stories, okay? I had a friend whose mother-in-law died suddenly, and I was traveling. I got to the airport, and he called me and said she had died tragically in her, or suddenly. She was older. She had died suddenly, and she was, her funeral would be in an hour. And I thought, well, I can get from Ithaca to Benetton in an hour, so I went. And her two daughters stood at the casket, and I saw the mother-in-law who had died. She was in the casket, but I saw her come up and put her arms around both her daughters. And I said to Dave, I says, oddest thing though, she was wearing a blue nightgown with a blue night coat, a bathrobe, and it had hot pink roses on each side of the bathrobe. I couldn't figure out why was she wearing that. He says, well, I found her. She got up and sat on the edge of the bed and fell over backwards dead after she put on her blue nightgown with the pink roses that matched her other nightgown. And he said, I guess she doesn't know we changed her for the funeral, but I saw her just like I saw you. And I don't care if you people believe that or not. It was my experience and meant for me to see. Then one night, my mother and I were very, very close. So 6 years after her death, I was still mourning her. And I was in an apartment in Spencer, and I woke up in the middle of the night and sat on the edge of the bed, and my mother was sitting next to me. And she put her hand on my knee and she says, Philip, I had my life. You've got to quit mourning me. And she says, I've had my life. You've got to have your life. You're not living your life by mourning me at all. And so I thought, I was still groggy from waking up, and I thought, that can't be my mother. She died 6 years ago. So I looked to my side where she was, and she was gone. And I never once mourned her again, because I knew she was okay. Probably my favorite story was I was doing a consultation with a woman out of state on the phone. And she said to me, I've locked all the doors in the house because my husband left for work and I don't want anyone coming in to bother the reading, the consultation. And I did a reading, and she said, that was wonderful. You hit a lot of things, and you did real good. And she says, I thought you'd tell me something about my daughter, like that. And I thought, well. And all of a sudden, I felt this terrible grief. And I says, oh, my God, your daughter's dead. And I said, she died tragically of injuries in a car accident. And she said, yes. And she was a little bit weepy. And I heard a young girl's voice say to me, tell Mom that I know she broke my fine gold chain necklace. And I said, this may not fit anywhere, but I heard a young girl's voice say, "Tell Mom I know she broke my fine gold chain necklace." So I said it to her and the phone went dead. So I kept saying, "Hello, hello, hello." Pretty soon she come on and she was sobbing. And she said, "The night my daughter was in an accident, we had, the Christmas before, had bought matching necklaces. And they had lucky pieces, lucky baubles on them. And we'd wear them together when we needed luck." And so she says, I hadn't touched my daughter's room for 2 years. And on the highboy dresser in her bedroom was that necklace, and she wasn't wearing it the night of the accident. And she says, I always thought, well, maybe if I hold that or put it with my necklace, that maybe that will help me in the consultation somehow to overcome my grief, because I've been stifled by my grief. So she says, I went and got the necklace, and I took the bauble off her necklace, and in so doing, I broke the fine gold chain that was on her necklace. And she said, ain't nobody in this house but me. And she says, and now I know my daughter is here with me. So she says, I don't have her physically, but you've proven to me I have her spiritually. And she said, my grief is gone. And so my work has been very gratifying. Some of the police cases I've done, I think to myself, you are weird, Phil. How the hell would you know that stuff? A case in Atlanta, Georgia I did. The guy had been dead 4 years. His sister sent me a picture of him when he was in a good physical state, just a snapshot. And I sent back, it was back at the time when I sent them out on cassette tapes. I'd talk into the cassette. And I said, this man is dead and he's got broken legs. And I said, and he's got 4 holes in his head. Well, I had holes in my head all my life, so I just knew that, I guess. But so she was so impressed with what I sent her that she took the tape to a detective, and he got the case out. It was a cold case, 4 years. And he was so impressed, he flew me to Thomaston, Georgia. And Tony here, who does my computer work, he went with me. And we first met the detectives, went to the house where the guy died, and the house was empty because it was being redone to sell. They had recarpeted, they had painted, we walked into the first room, which had to be a living room, second room, which would have been a dining room, but I stood there and he says, this room to the side was the dining room, but it wasn't the dining room because they put a hospital bed here and the guy died in the hospital bed where the dining room table was. And the detectives looked at each other like, I thought to myself, they're going to say, why did we pay you to come here? And so they didn't say anything. So I said, we have to leave here and go in the car, and I'll tell you where we have to go. And I think we can settle this for you. So we got in the car and went straight ahead about 5 blocks. I said, we got to turn right. We went down 3 or 4 blocks. Got to turn left. Go another block. We'll turn left again, and there'll be a narrow road going up to a body of water. And a big house will be by that body of water. Again, the detectives are looking at each other like, this guy's nuttier than a fruitcake. So they followed what I said. We went up to the top of this narrow road, and it was the reservoir for the city of Thomaston, Georgia. It was just an open lake. And beside it was a huge renovated building into an apartment house. And I said, there's going to be something about the second door from the left And I said, I think there's going to be something about a doctor. And the one detective couldn't hold himself anymore. He says, the woman, the widow, moved in with her boyfriend into that second apartment 2 months after her husband died. And I said, well, there's something about a doctor. Well, she went to the doctor the morning that her husband died, and she said, I need some tranquilizers. My husband died in the night. And so he gave her tranquilizers, and she gets back and finds her husband dead, supposedly. That's what she told the cops. I went to the doctors, come home, found my husband dead. He'd been murdered. He was in bed because he had broken both his legs falling off a roof. He was a roofer. And he had 4 holes in his head. And the detective said, she told the doctor she needed tranquilizers because he died in the night. And she told us that she come home and found him dead. And so the doctor sort of confirmed what his suspicion. And I told them, I keep seeing pennies. There's got to be something with a pennies in Texas. Her best friend, the wife's best friend, was named Penny. And they got drunk together one night. And Penny had moved to Texas. But before she did, they got drunk one night, and she confessed, the widow confessed to the murder, that she had killed him. And she didn't come home and found him dead. She left him dead when she went to the doctors. Must have had second thoughts. But she's in prison without parole, and wouldn't have been if I hadn't worked on the case. And so there's countless cases like that that I've worked. I found, and it's always been fun for me because I think, God, you are weird, Finn. You know, and so I've done various professions. And, you know, I work at my regular work. Everybody else I know is retired my age, but I can't retire. And I do that, but I also really feel that I'm sharing my gift when I do funeral service, when I do a service for a funeral. My favorite is the church, which I don't get paid for. You know, I've not got paid for that, but I love it. Because I think the church is a sanctuary for injured Christians. And I think a lot of Christians have been injured through the church. And I don't mean that in an unkind way, it's just the way it happened. We have to learn that our beliefs are our beliefs. That somebody else's beliefs are their beliefs, and we should try to respect that. If we could learn to respect that and follow the example that was given to us by God through Jesus, or through Allah, or through Buddha, or through whoever, there wouldn't be any war in Israel, there wouldn't be any war in the Ukraine, and we would all have a much better world in which to live. But I grew up where you identified through who you were as a person, through who you were in faith. And in so doing, I learned to love people regardless of who they are, you know. And I am so thankful that I grew up poor, because I know what it's like to be poor, you know, and I know what it's like to want and not get. But I know what it's like to want and to get, you know, and it's all about inspiration, perspiration, and everything, you know. And so I've had people ask me, because there was an article in I think one of the papers, about the house I lived in. I live in the former bed and breakfast in Candor at the edge of time. Some of you may remember Eva May. Eva May ran it for 34 years as a bed and breakfast. And she told me the story before she left about, this place is haunted. And I said, oh, really? I hope so. And she said that people that stay there, if they bring expensive perfume, it disappears. And she don't know where it goes, but it disappears. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And the house was built in 1860 by a general in the Civil War for the North who thought it was a safe place for all of his family. That's why it's so big. And that it was built for his family. And then in 1906, Dr. Amos Canfield, a neurosurgeon from New York, bought the house as a summer home. And he had a chauffeur, he had cooks and gardeners and things like that. And he was a leading neurosurgeon in New York City, and he had a patient who was in a wheelchair. And so he put in an elevator for the patient in the wheelchair. And Eva May said, and the patient was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I thought, well, Eva, you're getting old, and maybe you dreamt that or something. And then just 2 months ago, the Historical Society put a picture of Franklin Roosevelt sitting on the side porch. So I knew it was true. But my addition to that story is I sat during a consultation with a person in the parlor, and I could see the stairs, and I saw a little girl run up the stairs, and she was wearing a little frock dress with a pink sash and black leggings, and she skipped up the stairs, and she had French curls, and I thought, I wonder who that is. And I knew it was a spirit, and so I didn't question it. When we first opened, I was working with Louise, who helps me out some, and we were hanging a picture, which is a neat picture that hung in the brush and palette for years. It was 4 nude people swimming in the creek behind the brush and palette. I won't tell you who I think it is, and so we were hanging that picture, and someone come in the front door, and I said, we'll be with you in just a minute, because there's a bell that rings when the door opens. We'll be with you in just a minute. So I said, hello, hello. We went out and looked, and no one was there. And I don't think Louise believed at the time, but I think it helped convince her a little bit. And I think that sometimes people need for us to know they're around us, and that they'll let us know that they're around us. And when my grandfather died, he lived in Speedsville, and my aunt was getting ready to greet people for the calling hours. She went downstairs, and she saw a man standing over the casket. And she thought, she didn't know for sure who it was, so she put the pitcher of water she had down, turned around, and he was gone. And she saw him walking down the street, and she knew that it was her father who was laid out in the casket. And she knew that he had survived the change called death. So there's so many weird things that happen in life. Just accept it. You can question it, and try to make it so it isn't true, but I really believe our loved ones are still with us through the love we have, and I feel my work has proven that to me. And I don't care what anyone else's belief is. I know what my belief is, and I'm comfortable with it. So you can try to convince me all you want. You never will do it. I just know that it's a verified fact that I am weird. And I accept that. And I know that I've helped hundreds of people. And it's so good to... I didn't like myself when I was young, because I knew I was weird. and I was a loner sometimes. Even though I was around a lot of people, a lot of happy people are sad inside, and I was. But then I found love for myself. And God wants us to share that love, and each and every one of you has had that opportunity and continues to have it. So continue to share your gifts. You have a lot of gifts to share in whatever way. People think, no, I have no gift. And you do have gifts. Maybe just to be a mother or a grandmother or a friend. But you have a lot of gifts. So that tells you a little bit about where I've been and how I got here. And I don't know if you believe everything I told you, but if you don't, oh well. That's the way it is. And I hope I didn't scare you too much with the ghost stories. But if you, we're going to hopefully try to have a Christmas tea at the bed and breakfast this Christmas to raise some money for our church. And so keep your eye out for that, and that'll be a fun thing. And maybe that little girl will show up or something. So I think it'll be fun. Thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
So, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and come to some of our other programs.
Thank you.